I am 28M. I've never had a lot of money. Growing up, we lived in a small house on the edge of town, in a neighborhood that was far from fancy. My parents did the best they could, but there was always something that kept us from getting ahead. Credit cards, loans, always living paycheck to paycheck. My older siblings and I were used to hearing stories about how tough things were and how much my parents had sacrificed for us. We never had the newest stuff, and that was just the way it was. But I was different. I wasn't satisfied with that life, so I worked my ass off. High school was a blur of grades, part-time jobs, and scholarships. I landed a full ride to a good college, and from there I got into the tech industry. Fast forward a few years, and I was making a solid salary, enough to finally breathe a little. I had a plan. I wasn't going to be like my parents. I wasn't going to live in debt forever. I put my money into investments, built my savings, and finally I felt like I was on the right track. The best part, I could afford the little luxuries I'd never had. A nice car, some nice clothes, and an apartment I was proud of. But it didn't take long for things to change. As soon as I got my first big paycheck, my family started making little comments. At first it was subtle. Comments like, "Must be nice to have a stable job," or "I hope you're saving for the future." At first I just brushed them off. Then it escalated. My mom in particular started saying things like, "You know, we made so many sacrifices for you when you were younger. It'd be nice if you gave back a little." I didn't think too much of it at first. She had always been the type to hint at things. But then things really took a turn. She started asking for small amounts here and there, just to help out with some bills, she said. I'd send her a few $100s, no problem. But it never stopped. Soon my siblings, who were struggling financially, started expecting more too. My older brother asked me to pay for his car repairs. Then my sister wanted me to cover her rent because she was in between jobs. I didn't mind helping once in a while, but it quickly became clear they weren't just asking for a favor, they were expecting it. And once they realized I wasn't saying no, they started to push harder. It wasn't long before they started talking about a family contribution. My parents wanted me to send them a set amount of money each month. My mom specifically asked for 10 to 15% of my salary to help with household expenses. They argued that since I was the one making the most money, it was only fair that I redistribute my wealth. I just sat there stunned. I told them I'd help when I could, but I wasn't going to commit to a regular payment. I wasn't about to hand over a chunk of my salary every month, especially when I had my own future to think about. That didn't go over well. My parents accused me of being selfish. They said I had forgotten where I came from. My siblings called me ungrateful, and I could feel the pressure mounting. The worst part came a week later when my mom invited me over for what I thought was just a casual family dinner. But when I arrived, it turned into an ambush. My parents, along with my siblings, sat me down and started pressuring me to contribute. They said it wasn't fair that I was earning all this money while they were struggling. They reminded me of all the sacrifices they made for me, and how I owed them for it. I was caught off guard, but I stood my ground. I told them I wasn't going to be guilted into giving them my money. My life was my responsibility now, and I had plans for my future that didn't include supporting them financially. I made it clear that I wasn't going to be anyone's financial crutch. My parents didn't take it well. They gave me an ultimatum. Either I start contributing, or they'd cut ties with me. They said they couldn't keep supporting someone who didn't care about family. I wasn't about to let them manipulate me like that. I told them I'd think about it, but I wasn't going to be bullied into handing over my paycheck. Then, I got up and left. The next day, my phone blew up. Texts, calls, messages from my siblings and parents, all furious with me. They said I was being heartless, that I was abandoning them. They couldn't believe how selfish I was being, and it felt like they were all ganging up on me. It was hard to ignore, but I knew I had made the right decision. They had taken advantage of me for too long, and I wasn't going to let them do it anymore. So that's where I am now. I've cut ties with them, at least for the time being. I've set boundaries, but the guilt trips haven't stopped. They keep texting me, calling me names, and even trying to involve extended family members. But no matter what they throw at me, I'm standing firm. They think they're entitled to my salary, but I'm done playing their game. A few days after I walked out of that family dinner, I woke up to a barrage of notifications. My phone was buzzing nonstop. I thought it might have been work, but as I opened the messages, I realized it wasn't anything close to that. A few family members started sending passive-aggressive texts, and my mom added me to a group chat with her and my siblings. At first, it was subtle guilt tripping, but as I continued to refuse, tensions escalated, and others chimed in. At first, it felt like I was in a nightmare. Everyone I'd known my whole life was now turning on me. My mom started off by calling me selfish, greedy, and according to her, a disgrace to the family. My sister jumped in saying how disappointed she was in me, how I was turning my back on the people who raised me. The more I read, the worse it got. They were all calling me ungrateful and accusing me of forgetting where I came from. My mom sent me a long message, something like 10 paragraphs, claiming how hard they'd worked for me, how they made all these sacrifices to get me to where I am, and how now it was my duty to give back. She said that they were struggling, that my dad was working overtime, and my siblings were barely getting by. Apparently I was the only one who could help them, and if I didn't, I was essentially abandoning them. I didn't even know how to respond. I was stuck reading these messages over and over, each one more desperate and guilt-ridden than the last. It was like they were all trying to convince me that I was somehow the bad guy for not handing over my paycheck to them. And then it hit me. My older sister, the one I trusted the most, had also jumped in. She said I was letting the family down and that I should be more responsible with my success. What really got under my skin was that my sister had always been the one who seemed to understand me, who would get how hard I worked to get where I was. To see her now, siding with everyone else, accusing me of selfishness, it felt like a slap in the face. I never expected it to come from her. By now it was hard to focus. I had to keep my phone on silent at work because the messages kept pouring in. Every time I looked, there was more drama, more accusations. I could barely concentrate on my projects. Every time my phone buzzed, it was either a call or another text from a relative, making me feel worse and worse. I was about to break. But then my best friend from high school, Matt, reached out. He knew what had happened between me and my family, and he had always been supportive. He texted me, telling me that I didn't owe them anything, especially considering their history with money. He reminded me how they always mismanaged their finances, how they were the ones who dug themselves into this hole. He even pointed out how they had always relied on my older siblings to help out before me, and how they'd never repaid them. "You're not their ATM, man," he said. That helped ground me a little. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, my mom posted a passive-aggressive Facebook status. It was something like, "Some children forget where they came from," followed by a string of sad emoji faces. I saw it while I was at lunch, and I had to put my phone down for a moment. She wasn't even trying to hide the manipulation anymore. She wanted everyone to see that I was the bad guy. And then my dad, who had been silent this whole time, called me out of the blue. This was a first. He usually just let my mom handle everything, but not this time. He started with, "We need your help. We're behind on the mortgage, and it's getting really bad. If you could just send over some money." I stopped him mid-sentence. I told him again that I couldn't keep giving them money, that I wasn't their financial savior. I reminded him of all the times I'd been asked for help, and how every time they'd promised to manage better, but it never changed. "Don't act like this isn't your responsibility," he snapped. "You're the one who's making all the money. This is on you now." At that moment, I realized how far they had gone. It wasn't about helping out anymore. It was about entitlement. I could feel my resolve hardening. I couldn't be the family's bank. I told my dad that my answer was still no, and that if they were in this mess, they needed to figure it out themselves. He didn't say anything else, and I hung up. From that point on, the texts and calls from my family became quieter, more cold. My siblings didn't even reply to my messages. My parents stopped calling altogether. They didn't even bother reaching out after that day. I could tell they were giving me the silent treatment, waiting for me to cave. Then came the extended family. My aunt and uncle, who lived a few hours away, decided to get involved. They both called me, accusing me of being obsessed with money and status, and not caring about my parents. They tried to guilt-trip me, saying that family should come first, and that if I had a heart, I'd help my parents, who were clearly struggling. But this time, I wasn't having it. I told them that if they thought I owed them my salary, they could think again. They were upset, but I didn't care. I was done being the family's financial lifeline. A few days later, my mom sent one final message. This time, it wasn't just about money. She said, "You won't be welcome at family gatherings until you realize your duty to us." That was the breaking point. I knew they were serious about cutting me off, and for a second I questioned if I was doing the right thing. But then I thought about everything. The years of mismanagement, the guilt trips, the constant pressure. No, I wasn't the one in the wrong. That's when I made my move. I went to the family group chat and typed out a message to everyone. I told them that I would no longer be lending money to anyone, ever again. I made it clear that if they couldn't respect that, then they could continue without me. It felt like the right thing to do. And with that, I hit send. The fallout from my last message was more intense than I expected. The group chat went ballistic after I told them I wouldn't be lending any more money. My phone was blowing up all day, but this time, it wasn't just texts. It was screenshots of posts, public comments, and passive-aggressive statuses all over social media. My mom wasted no time posting a dramatic rant on Facebook. It was like she'd been waiting for the moment to go public. She wrote about how she had raised a son who became so successful only to have him turn his back on the very people who gave him everything. She painted me as the ungrateful son who abandoned his family, saying I had forgotten my roots, and was too busy with my new life to care about the ones who were struggling. She tagged a bunch of relatives in it, and it quickly spread like wildfire through the family. Not to be outdone, my sister and brother started posting their own cryptic messages. My sister wrote something like, "It's sad when people forget where they came from and lose sight of what's important." My brother posted a photo of an old family vacation with a caption that said, "Family is everything. Some people forget that." I was shocked by how quickly everything was spinning out of control. What really hurt was that they weren't just attacking me privately anymore. They were airing this dirty laundry to everyone. Friends, distant relatives, even people I hadn't spoken to in years. Then, the extended family got involved. Suddenly, my inbox was full of messages from relatives who, to be honest, I barely even knew. It was a bunch of "how could you do this? And your parents are suffering because of you" messages. These were people who had never contributed anything financially to the family, yet they were acting like they had a right to weigh in. It felt like they were all piling on, demanding answers for something I hadn't done wrong. But then came something I wasn't expecting at all. I was sitting at my desk at work when I got an email from HR. The subject line was from my boss, and it just said, "We need to talk." My heart dropped. I immediately thought it was something work-related, maybe an issue with a client or project. But when I opened it, the email was about something completely different. My mom called my workplace, claiming to be a concerned relative, and asked vague questions about my job and salary. HR didn't give her any information, but they did flag it as unusual and let me know. She even requested details on how often I got paid. HR had recognized the red flag immediately, given the nature of the call, and reported it back to my boss. I was furious. Not only was my mom trying to get financial details from my workplace without my consent, but she was pretending to be me. It felt like a new low, even for her. I immediately called my boss, who had already caught wind of it and was extremely understanding. He reassured me that he would handle the situation and suggested I might want to consider legal action for impersonation, but I wasn't sure I wanted to escalate it that far. At that moment, I just wanted to focus on my work and get away from the chaos. The next few days were full of more guilt tripping and attempts to manipulate me. My parents, still reeling from my refusal to help, started sending me more desperate messages. They went as far as to threaten to disown me unless I apologized and agreed to support them. It was their final power move. They thought that if they made me feel like I was losing my family, I'd cave and give them what they wanted. I responded with the one thing I knew would make them back off. I told them, "If that's your choice, I won't stop you." The message was clear. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me into doing something I didn't want to do. And then, for the first time in days, the group chat went silent. No more angry texts, no more posts. It was as if everyone had stopped for a moment to take in what had just happened. I didn't know if they were still mad or just too embarrassed to continue the fight, but I didn't care. What happened next really surprised me. My cousin Sarah, who had always been quiet during the whole ordeal, messaged me privately. She told me she was proud of me for standing up for myself. She said that it was good to see someone finally push back against the family's expectations and manipulation. That meant a lot, especially considering Sarah had always been on the outskirts of family drama. She'd never been one to get involved, but she told me that she'd been watching and was relieved that someone was finally calling out the behavior. As I thought more about it, I realized that Sarah wasn't the only one. Over the next couple of days, I started hearing more stories from other younger relatives. It turned out that many of them were dealing with the same kind of pressure from their parents. One of my cousins even told me that their mom had been begging them to co-sign a loan for years, and this time when they refused, they were made to feel guilty just like I had. It was almost like I had unknowingly sparked something. One by one, a few of my cousins started saying no to their parents' financial demands, and I couldn't help but feel a little proud. Maybe standing up to my family wasn't just about me. It was about showing others they didn't have to keep giving in to these constant demands. Things didn't stop there though. My mom, desperate and running out of options, found an even lower way to try to get to me. My mom tried reaching out to an old family friend, hoping they could convince me to reconsider. When that didn't work, she tried contacting one of my coworkers under the guise of checking in, but they immediately saw through it. My ex immediately shut it down. She told me everything when we spoke, and I could tell my mom had nothing left in her arsenal. At that point, I made the decision to cut ties with anyone who kept pushing me. I wasn't going to let myself be dragged back into their toxic web. I blocked my parents' numbers and did the same with anyone who continued to harass me about the situation. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. If they wanted to disown me, that was fine. I had no intention of apologizing or giving in. I was done being their financial safety net. After the intense fallout and the weeks of silence, I thought things might have calmed down. The family group chat had quieted, and aside from the occasional social media post, my phone had been relatively peaceful. But then, one morning I woke up to a flood of missed calls from my mom. At first I ignored it. I had been down this road before, and I knew it was just another round of manipulation. But the calls kept coming. I was tempted to block her number, but I thought maybe it was finally time to face whatever this was going to be. So, I answered. I expected an apology, maybe an explanation, but instead, my mom launched straight into guilt-tripping mode. She immediately said that I was tearing the family apart and that everyone is so disappointed in me. She went on about how I was the only one who could help, and that it was my duty to step up, because I was the successful one. It didn't take long for me to realize what was going on. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was about them once again trying to get me to bail them out. The real reason for her call was hidden beneath the usual emotional manipulation. My dad had lost his job a few months ago, and their mortgage was now months behind. They were in deep trouble, and they needed me to step up. This was the same story I had heard for years. They had always made poor financial decisions, living beyond their means, and expecting someone else to clean up the mess. I didn't raise my voice. I just reminded her that for years I had been telling them their spending habits were going to catch up with them. I told her it wasn't my job to fix their problems when they had ignored my advice. She tried to tell me that it was different this time and that things were really bad, but I wasn't buying it. I had heard this script too many times. Then my sister got involved. She sent me a message saying that she had been covering their bills for months, and that now it was my turn. She made it sound like I was being selfish for not helping out, as if we were all in this together. She even brought up how families should support each other and how much she had already done. I knew that what she was really saying was that she didn't want to carry this burden alone anymore, but I wasn't about to jump in. At that point, I thought I was done with it. But my parents weren't finished. A few days later, I was at work when things escalated to a new level. I was in a meeting when I got a text from security. It was a picture of my parents standing at the entrance of the building. They had shown up at my workplace unannounced. They were hoping to force a confrontation, to make me feel guilty in front of my colleagues. Security had recognized them immediately and blocked them at the entrance. I wasn't sure what to do. It was one thing to deal with their calls and messages, but this was different. I quickly contacted my boss, and by the time I left my meeting, my parents were already being escorted out by security. When I got back to my desk, I had a message from my boss. He was understanding about the situation, but he made it clear that this kind of thing couldn't keep happening. If my parents showed up again, it could seriously affect my reputation at work. I couldn't risk that. I appreciated that he gave me a warning, but the whole thing made me feel like my parents had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. My mom's response to being escorted out was to take to Facebook, where she posted an unhinged rant about me. She painted me as a cold-hearted son who abandoned his struggling parents. The post was filled with sob stories about how they had given me everything, and now I was too good to help them when they needed it most. She even tagged several family members in the post, hoping to rally support. This was the point where the situation really started to backfire. I expected some of the usual family members to jump in and support her, but what happened instead was surprising. While some relatives supported my parents, others stayed silent, unwilling to get involved. A few, who had been through similar situations, privately reached out to say they understood my decision. They had tried to guilt-trip them into giving money, even using the same emotional tactics. One cousin told me that she'd once given them a large sum of money, and when she needed help in return, they just disappeared. Another relative shared how they'd paid for their car repairs, only to have my mom act like nothing had happened afterward. It became clear to me that my parents weren't just trying to manipulate me, they had been doing this to everyone for years. Their financial instability wasn't a one-time thing, it was a pattern. They had always lived beyond their means, assuming that someone would always come through for them, but I wasn't going to be their safety net anymore. As I reflected on everything, it hit me just how much I had been enabling their poor choices. They had spent their entire lives making decisions that led to this point, and now I was supposed to swoop in and fix everything. But I knew that wouldn't work. It wasn't just about money. It was about their lack of responsibility, their refusal to change, and their endless demand for others to clean up their mess. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't be the one to save them. I had to let them face the consequences of their actions, just like I had to face mine. And if that meant they were angry at me, so be it. I wasn't going to be the one who kept falling for their manipulation. So I decided to stand firm. I cut off all contact with my parents and anyone who was still trying to drag me into their mess. I realized that in the end, it wasn't my responsibility to fix their financial problems. And if that meant I had to walk away from my family, then that's exactly what I was going to do. The aftermath of my mom's Facebook post turned out to be far messier than I expected. Initially, I thought it would just be the usual family drama, but it quickly spiraled into something much bigger. Within hours of her rant going up, the post started gaining attention, more attention than she anticipated, and not in the way she had hoped. At first, it was just a few comments, but then a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, one who had also been manipulated for money in the past, left a public comment. She pointed out that it wasn't fair to blame me for the situation when my parents had been financially reckless for decades. She reminded everyone that this wasn't the first time they'd made bad decisions and expected someone else to bail them out. That comment hit like a domino. Others started to chime in, adding their own stories. One cousin shared how my parents had pressured them into lending money for a business venture that turned out to be a scam. Another aunt mentioned that she had once lent my mom a large sum of money to cover her credit card bills, but never saw a penny of it again. It didn't stop there. The comments just kept coming. Some of the older relatives, like my aunts and uncles, admitted they had stopped lending my parents money years ago because they had grown tired of the endless promises to pay it back that never materialized. One uncle even joked that he had learned to lock up his wallet when they were around. It was clear that my parents' behavior had alienated more people than I ever knew. The facade they had built around themselves started to crumble. Realizing the tide was turning against her, my mom quickly deleted the post. She probably thought she could control the narrative by removing it. but the damage was already done. People had already seen the truth, and the fallout was in full swing. Some relatives began questioning my parents' version of events, while others stayed quiet. A few who had lent them money in the past spoke up, confirming that my parents had a history of financial irresponsibility. Some expressed regret for enabling them in the past, while others were openly relieved that I was finally standing up to them. It was surreal to watch. The quiet ones who had always let my parents run the show were now speaking out, but it didn't end there. My sister, who had been fully on my parents' side, finally realized what was happening. Over time, my sister became more frustrated with our parents. At first, she defended them, but after months of shouldering their financial burdens alone, she started questioning why she was the only one making sacrifices. She said she didn't understand before how deep the problem was. It was a small victory, but it felt like a turning point. She had always been so deeply involved in my parents' drama, but now she was seeing them for what they really were. Then came the inevitable. My mom, unable to accept that she was losing control of the situation, sent me a long-winded text message. She poured her heart out, saying I had broken her heart, and that I would regret my actions when she's gone. The guilt trip was as old as time, but this time I didn't even flinch. I ignored the message. It was a desperate attempt to manipulate me into feeling responsible for her choices. I had been there before, and I wasn't going to let it get to me now. A few days later, I got another piece of information that I wasn't expecting. My parents' house was in pre-foreclosure. They had been struggling with their mortgage for years, frequently falling behind but always managing to scrape by, until this time, when the bank finally stopped granting them extensions. I wasn't surprised, but it hit me hard nonetheless. I had known they were struggling, but this was different. The reality of it, the actual possibility of them losing everything, made it clear that they had truly burned every bridge they could. Despite all of that, I made my decision. I wasn't going to intervene. They had been given countless chances to get their act together. They had been bailed out more times than I could count. This wasn't my burden to carry anymore. I had to stop enabling them, and the only way to do that was to walk away completely. I went back into the family group chat and posted one final message. I told everyone that I was done with all the financial requests. I made it clear that if anyone expected me to hand over money, they could remove me from their contacts, because I wouldn't be answering anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. A few relatives quietly left the chat, clearly not willing to give up their expectation of financial support. A couple of people unfriended me on social media, but for the most part, it seemed like people were relieved. The toxic energy had been draining, and now that I was finally standing firm, it felt like the family was starting to breathe again. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. The constant weight of guilt and obligation that had been hanging over me was gone. I wasn't carrying my parents' financial problems anymore, and the burden of being the family bank was lifted. It felt like a huge weight had been taken off my shoulders. But the most surprising part came next. An older cousin of mine, someone I hadn't spoken to much in the past, reached out privately. She's a successful business owner, and she commended me for standing my ground. She shared how she had dealt with similar financial manipulation from her own parents, and how hard it had been to finally say no. She told me that she admired how I was handling everything and that I had made the right choice. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. It felt like the validation I needed, especially after the fallout with my own parents. Looking back on everything, I realized this whole experience was a blessing in disguise. It showed me who truly valued me, versus those who only saw me as a paycheck. The family that remained supportive was the one that mattered, and the rest, they were just reminders of the toxic patterns that had been controlling my life. It was painful, but in the end, it was the wake-up call I needed to free myself from their manipulation once and for all. It all came crashing down for my parents. Their house, the one they had lived in for over 20 years, was officially gone. The foreclosure process had been dragging on for months, but when the final notice came, it was too late to do anything about it. They had to pack up and leave within 30 days. I found out through a call from my sister, who had gotten the news from my mom. She was upset, but also trying to act like it wasn't a huge deal. It was clear they had no real plan for what came next. I couldn't help but wonder how they'd let things go this far, especially when they had so many chances to fix their situation. But as expected, instead of facing the reality of their actions, they found a way to blame me. The narrative they started pushing was that I had let my own parents become homeless. My mom started calling a few extended relatives, spreading this lie like wildfire. According to her, I had the money to help, but I refused, and now they were suffering because of my cold-hearted decision. I wasn't surprised, but the audacity still got to me. After everything, they were still trying to paint themselves as the victims. As if on cue, my sister reached out again. This time she was done with it. After months of covering for them, my sister started realizing she was being manipulated the same way I had been. She still felt guilty, but admitted she couldn't continue bailing them out. They weren't just struggling financially, they were irresponsible, manipulative, and had never once taken accountability for their actions. She told me she was done covering for them. It was the final straw for her. She had defended them for years, always justifying their behavior, but now she realized they would never change. She was angry at herself for being blind to it for so long, but it felt like a huge shift. We were finally on the same page, but the requests didn't stop. One evening, my dad called me. He said they had found a place to rent, but couldn't get approved because of their terrible credit. He asked if I would help them secure a rental. I reminded him that they had years to fix their financial situation, but instead, they kept making poor decisions and expecting someone else to bail them out. I told him I couldn't do it. He tried to guilt trip me by saying they didn't have anywhere else to go, but I knew that wasn't true. My mom, always trying to manipulate the situation, texted me the next day, saying she might have to move in with a friend if they didn't find something soon. She was clearly hoping to get a reaction from me. She wanted me to feel bad and swoop in for the rescue, but I wasn't falling for it. She had plenty of options: friends, distant family, or even a rental on her own if she was willing to live within her means. I knew she just wanted to play the victim card. The family dynamic was shifting fast. The relatives who had initially sided with my parents were starting to pull back. A couple of them sent me private messages, apologizing for doubting me, and admitting that they could now see how toxic my parents had been. They all knew about the manipulation and financial irresponsibility, but no one had ever really called them out before. I think seeing how hard I was sticking to my boundaries made them realize they didn't have to keep enabling my parents either. Then, just when I thought the drama was over, my mom tried one last-ditch attempt at an apology. She sent me a long message, claiming she was sorry for everything that had happened, and that she understood now how hard it had been on me. But of course the apology was laced with blame shifting. She said things like, "I know I made mistakes, but it's because you never supported us, and if you had just helped, this never would have happened." I could barely make it through the message before deleting it. It was the same old story, no real accountability, just a thinly veiled attempt to manipulate me into feeling guilty. I wasn't buying it. It wasn't long before my mom went radio silent on social media. After weeks of posting dramatic sob stories about their situation, she stopped posting altogether. I'm sure it was because the responses she was getting weren't what she expected. No one was offering sympathy anymore. Most people were either ignoring her posts or, like me, calling out the truth. It was clear that her act was losing its appeal. After weeks of silence, I thought my parents had finally moved on, until my cousin reached out, mentioning that they were still trying to find ways to get someone to support them. It wasn't much, just a small rundown apartment in a bad area. It was a massive downgrade from the house they had lost, and they absolutely hated it. My cousin said my dad had already started complaining about the neighborhood and how unfair life was, despite the fact that he had been the one to make so many bad decisions in the first place. It was the ultimate irony. The same man who had belittled my career choices for years was now struggling to adapt to a much humbler life. Meanwhile, things at work were going great. Without the constant pressure from my parents, I could finally focus on my career. I got a major promotion, one I had been working toward for years. The timing couldn't have been better. For the first time in a long time, I was enjoying my success without the constant worry about whether I was going to get a call for money or help. Looking back, I realized this whole experience was a wake-up call for me. I had been stuck in this toxic cycle, constantly being manipulated and guilt-tripped. But standing up for myself, setting boundaries, and refusing to be their safety net was the best decision I had ever made. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. For the first time in years, I felt true peace. There was no guilt, no manipulation, just freedom, and I knew I was never going back. It had been a few weeks of peace. After the chaos of the foreclosure and the fake apologies, things quieted down. No more sob stories on social media, no more calls or messages. For the first time in months, I wasn't being bombarded by my parents trying to manipulate me. I thought I was finally done with it all. But then, out of nowhere, I got a message from my mom. It was short, simple, and strangely cordial. "Let's put the past behind us. Family is forever." I stared at my phone for a while. For a moment, I thought maybe they had finally realized the consequences of their actions. Maybe they were actually trying to reconcile and move forward. But I knew better than to rush into things. The past few months had been full of empty promises, guilt trips, and blame shifting. I didn't respond immediately. I needed to process the message. Could they have finally learned their lesson? Or was this just another trap? A couple of days passed before I heard from my sister again. She had been quiet for a while, but now she seemed urgent. She told me something I hadn't expected. My parents had been asking around, trying to find out about my financial status. They were being discreet about it, but it was clear they had another plan in mind. It wasn't just about repairing the relationship. They were fishing for an opportunity to get their hands on more money. It wasn't hard to put two and two together. I'd been through this before. My parents weren't suddenly interested in family and reconciliation. They were just trying to find a way to tap into whatever I had left, and I wasn't about to let that happen. A few hours after my sister's warning, I got a call from my dad. He was calm, almost too calm, which made me suspicious right away. He started with small talk, nothing unusual, but then it came. The real request. He casually asked if I could co-sign for a rental. He said they were struggling, that they couldn't get approved anywhere, and that things were just too tight financially. I didn't hesitate. I told him flatly that I wasn't going to co-sign for anything. They had made their own bed, and it was time to lie in it. My dad tried to downplay the situation, talking about how they had no choice, but I was done with the excuses. They had years to fix their situation, and now they were trying to manipulate me into cleaning up their mess. He didn't give up though. He played the guilt card. "You know, you're forcing us to live in poverty," he said. "You've got a high-paying job, and here we are, struggling to get by. All we're asking for is a little help." That was when I really started to see how desperate they were. The blame was entirely on me now. If I didn't help, they were stuck. It was classic manipulation, shifting the responsibility for their poor choices onto me. But I wasn't having it. I told him point blank, "You had decades to build stability. This is your responsibility, not mine. I've been trying to help you for years, but you've never taken it seriously. I'm not getting involved anymore." I warned him that this would be the last time we had this conversation. I wasn't going to entertain their requests again. He tried to argue, but I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to back down. My mom, not to be left out, texted me shortly after. Her message was full of guilt tripping. "We're too old to start over," she said. "We shouldn't have to beg for help from our own son." She claimed that I owed them a comfortable life after all the sacrifices they had made for me. At that point, I knew there was no changing them. This wasn't about family. This was about them trying to get me to take responsibility for their mistakes. And I wasn't willing to do that anymore. I told her the same thing I told my dad. This was their mess and they needed to deal with it. I wasn't responsible for their choices or their lack of planning. I reminded her that, over the years, I had given them countless opportunities to get their finances in order. But they had ignored every chance to change, and now it was too late. That was the last straw. I blocked their numbers and removed them from my contacts. I had tried to help. I had set boundaries, and I had given them every chance to prove they could handle things on their own. But they hadn't changed, and I wasn't going to keep being their financial safety net. The fallout was immediate. My mom went on another social media rant, blaming me for everything. She accused me of abandoning them, of being heartless, and of turning my back on family. But this time, there was no one to listen. Her posts got little to no attention, and the few people who had previously supported her were now backing off. I saw the pattern. She was losing her grip. I didn't look back after that. The constant guilt trips, the manipulation, the never-ending cycle of asking for help. It was over. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. My phone didn't buzz with their messages or calls, and I wasn't constantly worried about whether they were going to try and trap me into giving them more money. I realized something. Standing my ground was the best thing I could have done. My parents would never change, and it wasn't my job to fix their mess. They had their own lives to live, and I had mine. Now, I was free from their manipulation. The next few weeks passed without any major drama. I focused on my work, and without the weight of my parents' demands, I excelled. I even got another promotion. The stress and emotional toll that they had caused me was gone, and I was finally living for myself. The relief was overwhelming. As for my parents, the cracks in their facade were starting to show. Their financial collapse had become undeniable, and now with no one left to support them, they were truly on their own. And I was perfectly fine with that. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace. It's been a full year since I cut ties with my parents for good. Life has changed in ways I never thought possible. I'm in a stable, happy relationship with someone who truly respects me and my boundaries. Work has been going great, and I've earned a major promotion that's allowed me to save up for something I've always dreamed of. A home of my own. No more living in the shadow of my parents' expectations. No more stress. No more guilt trips. Just peace. The contrast between my life now and the mess I used to deal with is almost unreal. It feels like an entirely different lifetime. As for my parents, their reality is far from what they had envisioned. They didn't end up in the nice rental they had hoped for, even after all the attempts to get me involved. They tried moving in with a distant relative, but even she quickly grew frustrated with their refusal to take responsibility. It became clear that they weren't looking for a fresh start. They were looking for another financial crutch. I'm not sure if she actually even likes them, but they're stuck there now. It's a small house, even older than theirs was, and they've had to downsize in every way possible. My mom still tries to put on a brave face, but it's clear the luxury they expected from me is gone. I don't hear about them much anymore, but I do get the occasional update from my sister. She's officially done with them too, which feels like a small victory. She'd been defending them for the longest time, constantly trying to make excuses for their actions, but after they asked her for money again, she snapped. She cut them off completely. Her frustration came out of nowhere. She told me how they were acting like nothing had changed, still blaming everyone else for their failures. It was the last straw for her. I had no idea how many of my relatives had been so blinded by my parents' manipulations until everything fell apart. The ones who used to pity them now see them for what they are: irresponsible, selfish, and incapable of taking responsibility. It's like the fog finally lifted for them, and they realized my parents had been playing them all along. The sympathy they once got is now replaced by judgment, and honestly, I don't think they'll ever be able to rebuild their reputation. People have just had enough. My mom, who used to flood social media with her dramatics, has gone silent. No more posts about how hard her life is or how ungrateful I am. It's as if she just disappeared from the internet altogether. I'm guessing that her attempts at sympathy weren't working anymore, so she stopped trying. Maybe she realized no one was buying it anymore. Then, out of nowhere, I got an email from my dad. It was an apology, or at least, that's what it was supposed to be. It was formal, stiff, and so clearly rehearsed it was almost laughable. He apologized for how things went down, but the message felt like something he copied from a script. There was no real emotion in it, just a bunch of empty words and vague promises about doing better in the future. It was almost insulting, but I didn't let myself get worked up over it. I'd moved on, and I wasn't going to get pulled back into their drama. I kept it simple. I replied, "I accept your apology, but my boundaries remain the same." I didn't need to say anything more. I didn't need to reopen old wounds or invite more manipulation. I just let it go. What struck me most in that moment was how much I had changed in the past year. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't upset. I didn't even feel guilt. All I felt was relief. Relief from standing firm and taking control of my own life. The burden I'd carried for so long was gone, and I couldn't believe how much lighter I felt. Now, I'm buying my own home. It's a small place, nothing extravagant, but it's mine. I remember a time when my parents used to mock my career choices, telling me I was being selfish for wanting a place of my own, as if it was a waste of money when I could be helping them out. Now, here I am, making the decision for myself, creating a future that I can be proud of. And I know my parents won't ever understand that, but that's okay. I don't need their approval anymore. The true meaning of family has shifted for me. I used to think it was about always being there for each other, no matter what. But what I've learned over the past year is that family is supposed to be about respect, love, and mutual support. What my parents wanted wasn't love, it was control. They wanted me to be their safety net, their fixer. But I've realized that I can't live my life for them. I can only live it for myself. And now that I'm free from their manipulation, I can focus on what truly matters to me, my career, my relationship, and building a future that feels right for me. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not bitter. I'm just done, and it feels amazing. So that's where things stand. My parents are stuck with the consequences of their actions. They're still struggling, and I don't think they'll ever be able to make peace with it. My sister and I are finally on the same page, and while we may never have the relationship we once dreamed of, we've moved past the chaos they caused. I'm building a life that's mine, and that's all I need. I've learned a lot in the past year, and if there's one thing I want anyone reading this to take away from it, it's this. Set your boundaries, stick to them, and don't let anyone manipulate you into sacrificing your happiness for theirs. It's not easy, but it's worth it. It's been a while since I last updated, and let me tell you, life has continued to surprise me in ways I never thought possible. Everything had seemed to settle down. My parents were still trying to dig themselves out of the mess they'd created, and I was just living my life, focusing on what really mattered, my career, my relationship, and my own peace of mind. It had been quiet, almost too quiet. I figured I'd finally left that chapter behind. But then, one afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated. I hadn't heard from my parents in months, and honestly I wasn't interested in hearing from them. But something made me pick up the phone anyway. The voice on the other end was my mom's, but there was something different about it. Softer, almost calm, not the frantic, manipulative tone I was used to. It was like she'd finally come to terms with something. She told me she needed to talk. I braced myself for the usual guilt trip, but what came next threw me off guard. She admitted that she and my dad were broke again. They were facing eviction, and after everything that had happened, they didn't have anywhere to turn. She asked, very plainly, if they could move in with me. I won't lie, part of me was tempted to just hang up right there. I'd been waiting for them to hit rock bottom, and it seemed like they finally had. But I didn't hang up. I let her keep talking. It was the first time in years that I didn't feel the weight of their manipulation. She wasn't asking for money this time. She wasn't trying to guilt trip me into saving them. She was just desperate. It wasn't the same woman who had tried to control my life, it seemed. But even then, I knew better than to let that calm tone fool me. This was just another play. They hadn't learned anything. They hadn't taken responsibility for their actions. They were still trying to use me to get out of the mess they had created for themselves. I told her, plain and simple, you made your choices. Live with them. There was silence on the other end. She didn't say anything for a long moment, and then out of nowhere, she pulled the last card she could. She said, "You're my son. I gave you life. Don't you owe me?" The words hit me, but only because I knew exactly what she was trying to do. She wasn't just asking for help. She was demanding it. She was trying to make me feel responsible for her mistakes, trying to pull on the last thread of guilt she thought she could manipulate. I didn't hesitate. I wasn't going to fall for it again, I said, and I gave you every chance to change. You chose not to. Goodbye. And I hung up. For the first time in years, I didn't feel a weight on my chest. No guilt, no anger, no frustration. I felt free. It was like a door had slammed shut, and I was finally able to breathe again without worrying about them trying to drag me back into their chaos. Not even 10 minutes later, my sister called. She was laughing, almost hysterically, but I could tell it was a laugh of relief. Turns out, she'd gotten the same call. They'd guilt-tripped her too, but she'd had enough as well. She wasn't going to get dragged into their drama again either. We shared a moment of pure, unfiltered relief. knowing that we had both finally broken free from their toxic cycle. It didn't take long for word to spread either. The extended family, who had been sympathetic to my parents before, didn't offer a single word of support this time. No one intervened, no one tried to mediate, no one was making excuses for them anymore. My parents were completely on their own. I heard later from a distant relative that my parents were now living in a tiny rundown apartment. The place was barely affordable for them, and from what I gathered, they were struggling just to make ends meet. I won't lie, I didn't feel any satisfaction hearing this, but I also didn't feel bad. They'd had years to fix their lives. They'd had decades of chances to take responsibility for their actions. Now they had to face the consequences of their choices. And me, I'm thriving. I don't have the weight of their expectations on me anymore. I'm not responsible for their failures. I'm not responsible for their happiness or their stability. I'm in control of my own life, and for the first time, I feel at peace. As for the meaning of family, well, it's clear to me now. It's not about blood. It's about mutual respect and love. It's about giving and receiving, not about one person constantly taking while the other gives everything. I found my real family in the people who respect my boundaries and support me without trying to use me. I've built a life that's mine, and that's what truly matters. So that's it, the final twist. I don't know what's next for my parents, but I know what's next for me, and that's all I need to focus on now. Thanks for following along with this journey. It's been a wild ride, but I'm finally free.